Welcome to Trial Site News Podcast Series. Today we are on the topic of South Africa and the fight over ivermectin for use against COVID 19. Now, to do this, we have Shabnam Palesa Mohamed as a guest on our show today to discuss the state of affairs in South Africa. Now, Shabnam is an activist, journalist, attorney, author, and an editor. Now, for this conversation, it is important to note that Shabnam is the founder of SAHARI, which is an advocacy group for the urgent approval and efficient rollout of ivermectin as basic medicine in South Africa. Her stated effort is all about health, human rights efforts in South Africa. And so, Shabnam, thank you so much for joining us on our program today.
Thank you, Adrian, for this wonderful opportunity, and just congratulations to Trial Site News for your amazing work in health as a human right.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that. But we've been following your work down in South Africa, and it's been fascinating. Now, on that note, it has been a roller coaster ride watching the many twists and turns of the drug ivermectin, both here in the States and around the globe, and especially in South Africa, which included an attempt to criminalize the use of the drug. So, can you share for our audience the state of COVID 19 in South Africa? What is the current situation? How badly is lockdown affecting people's lives and health?
Absolutely. I mean, it's just been a devastating time for South Africans in many ways, from a physical health point of view to a mental health point of view, dealing with lockdown, dealing with the loss of jobs, businesses, just psychological trauma at the lockdown, and the often, sort of rules that make no sense, bordering on fascism many times, if instances of police brutality, the breakdown of our hospital systems, where hospitals don't have enough medicine, don't have enough staff, don't have enough capacity, where people are too scared to go to hospital, even if it's a non-COVID related health issue, Adrian. People are too scared to go because what will happen? Will I come back alive? And those that do, I mean, yes, of course, COVID has a 97% recovery rate. But of course, there are people who die, tragically so. And of course, there's the long haulers who suffer with side effects afterwards. But we suffer from a broken healthcare system, Adrian. It is completely fractured and broken. It is in a crisis and a coma even before COVID-19. This has just exacerbated the issues and the impact on the people, as well as brought to light the deep fractures that we need to address openly if we are about to transform healthcare in our country.
Now, we know that there are challenges with vaccinations in South Africa, and there's the issue of indemnifying pharmaceutical companies through NDAs. That's a big one. Can you expound on that?
So the vaccination program has begun, and there's certain vaccines that have a very good track record, and rightly so. Amongst the current lot, there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy, and I think rightly so. I think people have the right to ask questions because these products have been created so quickly, and because we're seeing side effects being experienced or adverse effects being experienced in other countries, and also in our own, lots of censorship about that. Of course, we want it to work, but there's no way we're going to be able to roll out vaccines to our entire nation. That's simply not going to happen. We don't have the logistics to be able to do that. Because of apartheid and the economic apartheid that still exists. A lot of people still live in rural areas without running water, without electricity, without proper homes. So they're not even really thinking about access to vaccines, which they're never going to get anyway. But the question about these NDAs related to these pharmaceutical companies is a hot topic debate in our country, because our country's government has signed us into agreements with pharmaceutical companies of whose contents we have no idea. We don't know what we've actually been signed up for. And this is, very much unknown in our kind of country, which is, as much as it has serious issues, is very obsessed with transparency and knowing what it is we signed up for. Now we don't. And what's particularly scary about that is, and you might know in other countries, especially South American countries, they have been harassed and threatened by pharmaceutical companies who've said, look, if you want our vaccines, you are going to hand over your military bases, your embassies, your reserve banks, transfer millions and billions into our accounts, and indemnify us for non-delivery or delayed delivery, negligence, fraud, and any harm that comes to your people. And so naturally, certain countries have said, absolutely not. You've made us change our laws. You've made us do all these sorts of things. You've practically held us at a sort of corporate gunpoint, and that's what it is. But we don't know in our country, in South Africa, as to whether our government has signed us up for the same terrifying conditions. So certainly, I think that there are going to be legal challenges, Adrian, to have those NDAs released, unredacted, so the nation knows exactly what we've been signed up for, and why would they have to be NDAs in the first place?
Now, if you had to speculate, why do you assume that your government would sign these types of NDAs agreements?
Well, for me, the only reason would be that these NDAs are similar to what South American countries have been threatened into, that they are a sort of a collateral type of guarantee thing going on, where if you want our vaccines, this is what you've got to give us. And it's a corporate takeover is what it is in essence. And I can't think of any other reason why any country would sign up for an NDA. The intellectual property issue is another one. But certainly corporates that operate in this particular type of way are very dangerous to deal with. And of course, you have things like tender corruption and that kind of thing that's going on, where politicians have conflict of interest issues, where they have shares or an interest in a pharmaceutical company, which is a very big problem in our country and around the world. So for me, those would be the two primary reasons. What have we signed over, and who stands to benefit from these secret deals?
So, on that note, then let's talk about the movement that you formed called SAHARI, which is South Africa has a right to ivermectin, and an NPC called Transformative Health Justice, or THJ. What was the drive to create these?
So SAHARI, South Africa has a right to ivermectin, was launched exactly 2 months ago, just over 2 months ago, on the January the 2nd. And it was driven by research that I had been doing on alternative platforms, because you won't find them on certain mainstream censored platforms. And I came across ivermectin being spoken about by various doctors and scientists. And of course, that impassioned plea by the FLCCC's Pierre Corey, which got me even more intrigued into finding out, well, what is this drug about? And of course, I'm classically trained as a lawyer. So for me, it's all about the evidence. And as a journalist, it's about looking behind that curtain. As an activist, it's about challenging the powers that be. And so I had enough information by the time I got to January the 2nd to say, South Africa, given its history and its record of advocacy on human rights, on ARVs, etc., we need to have our own movements. And of course, I'd noticed that there were other movements on Facebook that had started, in other countries. And so I said, well, this is the global movement, and South Africa's got to get involved. And so that's when we launched South Africa has a right to ivermectin, and specifically coaching it in those terms. It's not a question, it's a statement. And it's grown exponentially. Censorship aside, I'd say we have at least 100,000 members who are actively involved in driving this campaign, in educating themselves and each other. We've also launched the People's Medicine campaign to defeat the online censorship. We've created flyers and stickers, and we're on the ground regularly sharing that information. We've translated it into various languages so people know that ivermectin does exist, that what you've been hearing, that it's toxic, that it doesn't work, etc., is actually fake news. The science is unequivocal. These are the scientists you should actually be listening to, but also you should be asking questions as to why your government would not roll out ivermectin to save your life, because it has been rolled out in all these other countries, and look at the impact. And so I started also hosting, I host a radio show called The People's Voice, and I started bringing on guests like Dr. Pierre Corey, Dr. Paul Marek, who's of course South African born, Dr. Nasi Madlana, who works at one of our public hospitals here in South Africa and is just having a really difficult time, where people are dying more from the structural issues of capacity than they are from COVID. So we have very serious issues. Lawyers, certain politicians who have actually taken up the cudgels and are speaking out for ivermectin. They're few and far between, unfortunately, because everyone's bought into the pharmaceutical only agenda, which is quite bizarre. And scientists and doctors and civil society and just consistently having these shows to bring the truth and the facts out to the public. And of course, coming across Child Side News, and that's how I got connected with Dr. Pierre Corey, etc. And it's just been absolutely brilliant for people who have been feeling very helpless, not in control, just not in charge of their lives, to suddenly have something to wake up for and to fight for, which is their right to medicine, the right to health, the right to life. It's just been absolutely brilliant. And we're involved largely in education, advocacy on the ground, online, but also challenging the authorities consistently, and also private hospitals who refuse to either administer or allow the administration of ivermectin. And we've got to pressure them on social media to say, hang on, this person's life is actually in danger. You can't not allow or allow somebody else to administer the medicine. So we do calls to action where we get everybody involved and we go and say, hang on, we're watching you, do the right thing. And then, of course, there was a need to sort of formalize the activities. And so we launched a nonprofit company called Transformative Health Justice, which will, of course, drive the ivermectin campaign, but also other campaigns related to physical health, related to mental health issues, and the deep structural inequalities in our country that affect healthcare. So it's been brilliant thus far, and we're looking forward to transforming healthcare in our country.
So let's dial in further then on ivermectin in South Africa and this roller coaster ride that's been going on here, from the criminalization to acceptance, sort of. We wrote at trialsitenews.com about the recent legal actions. Could you share what is your point of view as to what has been going on here?
Well, it's been bizarre. I mean, but it certainly is sort of a flashing red flag where your country decides to criminalize a drug that is recognized by the WHO, which is fraught with issues, by the way, conflicts of interest in funding. But the WHO, which you purport to follow, recognizes this drug as an essential medicine. We know that it has an incomparable even safety record. We know that it's been used to combat other viruses like Zika, for example. So certainly there is evidence to suggest, and of course the evidence for COVID started emerging as far back as March or April in 2020. And so we have to, of course, question why. Was our regulatory authority, our government officials, media, not talking about ivermectin? Of course, they decided to paint it with the same hydrochloroquine brush conveniently. And of course, we know that Lancet subsequently retracted that paper on hydrochloroquine, which was very interesting as well. But of course, criminalizing doctors, harassing them. I mean, doctors were shoved against walls and searched. People were meant to feel like criminals that have to, in the dead of night, try and access this drug, this life-saving, Nobel Prize-winning drug. It is absolutely insane. And so we've progressed somewhat since then. Of course, SAPRA created the Section 21 compassionate access, which is the least compassionate way to have done things, because we have a 50% at least unemployment rate in our country, Adrian. The reality is the masses of our people will not be able to afford a 300 Rand Section 21 application fee, plus a doctor's fee, plus transport, plus childcare, plus food. Got 4 to 5 people in their family. It was never going to work. And it doesn't work. Doctors, again, today, I was in a meeting with some doctors today, and they've said it's not working. They don't get responses from SAPRA. And by the time they do, if they do, it's often too late. The patient has died, leaving traumatized families behind. And if you follow the work of people like Dr. Tess Lowry, I mean, the meta-analysis is unequivocal. It's clear. At least 70% of people's lives could have and can be saved. And now we're facing the third wave, of course. So serious questions need to be asked. In terms of SAPRA, they are, again, conflict of interest issues in terms of its leadership, who have roles in pharmaceutical companies and are consultants in pharmaceutical companies, who of course don't want ivermectin to be the solution, because what would then happen to the profit agenda that they've signed us all up for? So it's insidious, but it certainly is waking our people up to the reality of you can't just trust anybody and assume that your authorities are making good decisions on your behalf, and that we have to keep campaigning and advocating until what we have is rollout to the poorest of the poor. If access is only for the so-called middle class, that's not access. What we want is for our poor to have access at public hospitals, at clinics, at community centers. Then we can say we have leadership that actually cares about us. But we're so far beyond that point, Adrian. The mere fact that we've had to fight so hard all these months, and we're still nowhere. In fact, there's court cases coming up at the end of the month. We're still not where we need to be. Clearly shows us the level of influence in organizations like SAHARA, which are largely funded by organizations that have an interest in pharmaceutical companies, who provide, a substantial amount of funding to the regulatory authority, and they don't see this as a conflict of interest issue. Even the WHO, and in terms of its funding. So I think nationally and internationally, a picture is starting to emerge, and people are realizing that we don't have people-centered healthcare. We have what is called profit over people, and that we have to unite for the sake of humanity and for the sake of our health and our lives.
So, based on this unfolding situation, then, what do you think will happen next?
Well, we know that there's some court cases coming up at the end of the month. We have been having meetings with the South African Human Rights Commission. That is the approach that we're taking, because we don't know what's going to happen in court, how many appeals there's going to be, how long it's probably going to be dragged out. And we need it to be seen as a human rights issue, not just a matter of the law, because of course the law and justice are two completely different things. So I think there's at least a 60% chance, and there's various parties who are going to court, I think 4 at the end of this month. There's a 60% chance that they will be successful. But there is that 40% danger zone where, presiding officer could be convinced that SAHARA is making good decisions, or the Department of Health is making good decisions, and they're not. But thankfully, there is the evidence and the work of people like Dr. Testori and the FLCCC protocols that are going to be used as part of these applications to say, here is the evidence. Incidentally and significantly, Dr. Testori did contact SAHARA many, many months ago saying, I've got this evidence. She's South African born, right? And she was completely ignored. So we've got to ask ourselves exactly what is going on in South Africa, but also around the world in countries that are obstructing ivermectin. Those that are not, I can say, have genuine interest in the lives of their people. I mean, Zimbabwe has rolled ivermectin out. It doesn't make any sense for South Africa, which is supposed to be this powerhouse on the continent, not to have done that, but for the influence of pharmaceutical companies who have been found guilty of doing the most outrageously shocking crimes. And of course, our authorities who have vested interest as a result.
So, I want to ask you to speculate here. Why do you think there are such hostile forces to such a well-known economical drug?
For me, it's the pharmaceutical company influence, and it's also the vested interest of authorities who have either shares in these companies, who receive funding, because, the lack of funding is a very serious issue. So if you've got a health authority or a researcher who wants to do amazing research into healthcare, but is constrained by the fact that they don't have the funding, then they're forced to rely on funders that are unscrupulous and unethical. And, I think that's where the hostility and these are the hostile forces. It's the pharmaceutical companies. It can't really be anything else. There is no profit in cure. There is profit in repeat customers. And one of the shows I hosted earlier this month, there was a speaker who underscored that with the fact, these are not conspiracy theories, but of course, research it on Google. You may not find it. So I'm going to read a little bit to you and your viewers, Adrian. In 2002, AstraZeneca marketed a drug called Seroquel for schizophrenia and bipolar. The end result was 40,000 lawsuits worth $1 billion for causing cardiovascular issues, diabetes, and kidney failure, eventually leading to death. Pfizer, which is next on our list in South Africa, was sued $4 billion for marketing drugs that maimed or killed people. Johnson & Johnson's Tylenol contained asbestos, which is a known carcinogen. So in 2019, 33,000 bottles of their baby powder containing asbestos, for which there are 50,000 lawsuits against them, were recalled. And then, of course, Pfizer, in order to sell vaccines to Argentina, have done what we've just spoken about. They've demanded to be protected from and compensated for any lawsuits and adverse effects. They want the national asset, sovereign assets, and as security. So these are demonstrably evil acts by these particular corporates. And in terms of South African constitution, in terms of our finance management acts, these are violations. How do we do business with countries that have a proven track record of fraud, corruption, racketeering, and harm? But this is where the hostility is coming from. There really is no other answer. There's too many deals that have been signed. There's too many people who need funding for research, and they don't want to give up their lucrative positions and benefits. And so that explains it. It actually can't be anything else because the evidence for ivermectin is overwhelming, unequivocal. Even Andrew Hill, who recently confessed that, or a couple of months ago confessed that, and he's a WHO researcher, confessed that his finding, which is not congruent with the content of his research, is influenced by his sponsor. But when he had a panel discussion in South Africa, said to us, get supplies and get it now. But one of the biggest problems is that his sponsor is also invested into research on ivermectin. So I think that our authorities are waiting for that sponsor's trials to roll out. It's probably going to be a negative finding, which nobody's going to believe anyway. And if it is a positive finding, it's to drive profits in that direction again. So either, and it's the Gates Foundation, will make money off vaccines or they'll make money off ivermectin. Either way, they control demand, they control supply, and it's unfortunately the law of crisis capitalism.
So, what do you think South Africa needs to do then to move ahead or forward with healthcare?
Several things. I think we need people-centered healthcare in our country. We need to build from the bottom up and community level, as opposed to this, centralized system that we've got, where we've got no control over decisions that are made. We need to stop the corruption that is eating into the resources of the country that should be used to build our healthcare infrastructure, to hire the kind of talent and skills that we need, which are leaving our country as a result of the total, breakdown of the healthcare system. And of course, we need to appoint a healthcare minister who has worked on the ground, who is loyal to the people, and who has no conflict of interest issues. And our constitution allows us to appoint 2 ministers from outside the General Assembly. It's never, I don't think it's ever happened, or it may have happened many, many years ago. But certainly in what we've learned now is that the health minister and the education minister have got to be from civil society. It's basic fundamental rights, and those are 2 of the ways in which we can access the services and the human rights that we need, but also hold accountability to the people that we appoint in these positions. So yes, structural reform, accountability in terms of corruption, community-based healthcare, and decentralizing the power that exists at the top. These are some of the measures that have to be taken to take back the healthcare system, because nobody is going to do it for us, Adrian. We're pretty much the people we've been waiting for.
So, on that note, then, what are your plans next for your organizations?
So tomorrow, there's going to be a worldwide freedom rally that's happening there. South Africa is also taking a part in, and I'll be speaking there together with my colleague, Virushka. And we're also parallel to that, still running our People's Medicine campaign. So as much as we're there for the Freedom Rally, we'll still be handing out flyers and stickers and engaging people and saying, have you heard about ivermectin? Interestingly, a lot of people have. The stats have just plummeted, and the authorities have no idea why. We know why. It's because of ivermectin. It's because we're helping each other to live. We're helping friends, neighbors, co-workers, and perfect strangers to have access to this ivermectin. So we will be campaigning tomorrow at the Worldwide Freedom Rally in different cities in South Africa, and we'll continue with that campaign. We also are determined to distribute ivermectin to the poor, so we'll be fundraising for that to make sure that they have access. Really important to us. In terms of legal action, we are considering our options. We'll have to have a look what happens at the end of the month. SAPRA has just put out a statement today, which was very disappointing, and still is saying there's not enough evidence. It's the most bizarre, dystopian time that we're actually living in. How they could possibly say that unless it was for conflict of interest is just inexplicable. And of course, very excitingly, we are working on an animation project telling the story of ivermectin and centering people power in that story. And we're collaborating there with a number of people. More information on that will be released soon. And the first episode is going to be a 1 to 2 minute episode, just telling the story of the scientists who got behind the ivermectin, the doctors, and the advocacy from civil society and the activists, and how everyone's just come together to say we need a people-centered healthcare system that is ethical, that is accountable, that is representative, and is for the people.
Now, before we let you go today, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We know you're incredibly busy. Is there anything else that you'd like to add for our audience?
I think I want to speak to global audiences because you have that reach and that respect to say that you're not alone, that we are experiencing very similar issues in so many countries around the world where our leaders don't care about us, where healthcare is not given the priority that it actually needs to be given. And that we have to stand together and unite, no matter what country you're from, no matter what city you're from. We have to unite for healthcare and create people-centered healthcare systems in each and every country. And perhaps what we need to launch is the People's Health Organization, far more appropriate than what we've been suffering under for all this time, thinking that it was our only choice. We need to reach out to each other in the spirit of Ubuntu, as we say in South Africa, I am because you are, and that the power of the people is stronger than people in power.
Well, Shabnam, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. We greatly appreciate you coming on.
Thank you very much, Adrian, and of course to Trial Site News for your incredible work.